When Walter Calloway passed away after 78 years of life, he left behind a farmhouse so old and forgotten that the roof had begun to cave in on one side. He left it to his youngest daughter Maggie, not as a gift, but as an afterthought. Her brother Preston walked away with the land, the savings, and the family business. Her sister Diane got the jewelry, the antiques, and the lake house. And Maggie got the crumbling farmhouse at the edge of the property that no one had stepped inside in over a decade. The family laughed. Even the lawyer smiled. But what was sealed beneath the floor of that forgotten farmhouse didn't just shock everyone who heard about it. It brought Preston and Diane to Maggie's doorstep, hats in hand, begging for a piece of something they had already thrown away. Stay with me until the end, because what Maggie found hidden beneath those rotting floorboards will remind you that the ones who are overlooked are sometimes the ones sitting on top of the greatest treasure. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Calloway, Maggie to everyone who knew her, had spent most of her 58 years being the quiet one. Not invisible exactly, but the kind of person who blended into the background of a family portrait while others stood front and center. She was the youngest of 3 children born to Walter and Ruth Calloway, raised on a modest but proud piece of land in Clover Ridge, Tennessee, a small town where everybody knew your name and your business and your grandmother's maiden name without ever having to ask. Walter Calloway was a man of few words and firm opinions. He had built his small agricultural supply business from nothing, turning a single storefront on Clover Ridge's main road into a regional name that farmers across 3 counties trusted. He was respected in town. He was loved in the way that strict and distant fathers are loved, from a careful distance, with admiration threaded through with just a little bit of fear. He showed affection through provision, not tenderness. He said, "I'm proud of you," with a firm handshake, never with open arms. Ruth, Maggie's mother, had been the warmth in the household. She had died of a heart condition when Maggie was just 34, and her absence had left a quiet hollow in the family that none of them ever fully addressed. After Ruth passed, the 3 siblings drifted in their separate directions. Preston, the eldest, took a more active role in the business. Diane, the middle child, married well and moved an hour away to Nashville, and Maggie stayed close. That was always Maggie's role, the one who stayed close. She had built a modest life in Clover Ridge. She had worked for 22 years as an office administrator at the county's agricultural extension office, a job she was good at and that suited her quiet, methodical nature. She had never married, though not for lack of trying. A long relationship in her late 30s had ended badly, and Maggie had decided afterward that she was better suited to her own company. She had a small rented house on Birchwood Lane, a vegetable garden she was proud of, and a tabby cat named Biscuit. She visited her father every Sunday, brought him food he didn't really need, sat with him through television programs he half-watched, listened to the same stories about the business, about the land, about how things used to be. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't celebrated, but Maggie was there, every single Sunday for years. While Preston was busy expanding the business and Diane was busy with her Nashville social life, Maggie was the one who drove Walter to his doctor's appointments, who coordinated his medications, who called the repairman when the furnace broke in January and Walter hadn't told anyone. She didn't do it for recognition, she did it because someone had to, and because despite everything she loved her father. She just never quite felt that he saw her. Not really. Not the way he saw Preston, who had inherited Walter's business instincts and his stubbornness in equal measure. Not the way he saw Diane, who had inherited Ruth's beauty and Walter's ambition. Maggie had inherited her mother's patience and her father's quietness, a combination that made her easy to overlook and easier to take for granted. She told herself it didn't bother her. She had gotten very good at telling herself that. Walter's health began declining seriously in his mid-70s. A series of small strokes left him slower, more confused at times, more irritable at others. Maggie adjusted her schedule to check on him more frequently. Some weeks she was there 4 or 5 times, not just Sundays. Preston visited when he could, which was less often than it probably should have been. Diane called regularly, but the drive from Nashville was long and she had her own family to manage. The last year of Walter's life was hard. He required more help than any of them had fully anticipated. Maggie quietly became his primary caretaker, navigating the complexity of his medical needs, his stubborn refusal to accept certain kinds of help, and the guilt she felt every time she wondered whether she was doing enough. She was not a nurse. She was not trained for any of this, but she showed up anyway every day that she could. Walter Calloway passed away on a Tuesday morning in early April, with spring just beginning to soften the Tennessee hills back to green. He was 78 years old. He died in his own bed, which was what he had always wanted. Maggie had been there the night before. She had held his hand. She did not know then that a week later, sitting in a lawyer's office in downtown Clover Ridge, she would understand for the first time just how little all of that had counted for in her father's final accounting of things. But that moment was still coming. For now, she sat in the passenger seat of Preston's car on the drive home from the funeral home, watching the Tennessee countryside roll past the window, and told herself that whatever came next, she would handle it the way she always handled things, quietly, without complaint, alone. The reading of Walter Calloway's will took place 8 days after the funeral, in the downtown Clover Ridge office of Harmon Bell, the family's attorney for the better part of 3 decades. It was a Wednesday afternoon, overcast and gray, the kind of spring day that couldn't quite decide whether it wanted to be warm or cold. Maggie arrived first. She always arrived first. She sat in one of the stiff leather chairs across from Harmon's desk and folded her hands in her lap and waited. The office smelled of old paper and wood polish, and a grandfather clock in the corner ticked with an authority that seemed out of place in such a small room. She hadn't slept well in days. Grief was like that. It didn't knock you flat all at once so much as it wore you down slowly, like water on stone. Preston arrived 10 minutes late with Cecile on his arm. Cecile was Preston's wife of 14 years, a sharp-featured woman from Knoxville who had never quite warmed to Maggie and had never bothered to hide it. She wore a dark blazer and pearl earrings and carried herself with the particular confidence of a woman who already knew how an afternoon was going to go. Preston kissed Maggie on the cheek, asked how she was holding up, didn't really wait for the answer. He sat down and immediately began scrolling through his phone. Diane arrived a few minutes after that, her husband Raymond waiting outside in the car because he hadn't wanted to intrude on a family matter, which Maggie had always thought was the most considerate thing Raymond had ever done. Diane hugged Maggie longer than Preston had, and her eyes were still red-rimmed from crying, which made Maggie feel a small, guilty flicker of tenderness toward her sister. Whatever their differences, they had both lost their father. Harmon Bell came in, set a folder on the desk, exchanged the necessary pleasantries, and got down to business with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this many times and understood that people in grief wanted it over with. Walter Calloway's will was thorough and specific. He had clearly put thought into it, which somehow made everything that followed feel more deliberate. Preston received the largest share of the estate by a significant margin. The agricultural supply business, in full, along with the primary parcel of land, 42 acres of good Tennessee farmland that had been in the Calloway family for generations, passed to him. Additionally, Preston received the contents of Walter's primary savings and investment accounts, which together represented the vast majority of Walter's liquid assets. It was a staggering amount of inheritance for one person. Cecile didn't smile, but her posture changed in a way that amounted to the same thing. Diane received the lake house in Cumberland County, which Walter and Ruth had purchased together in the 1980s and which held enormous sentimental value. She also received Ruth's jewelry collection, a set of antique dining furniture that had been in Ruth's family originally, and a portion of Walter's remaining savings. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Maggie sat very still through all of this. She told herself she wasn't keeping score. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself a lot of things in those few minutes, because the alternative was feeling the full weight of what was happening in real time, and she wasn't sure she could do that in front of Cecile. Then Harmon Bell cleared his throat and turned to the final item. "To my youngest daughter, Margaret Ann Calloway," he read, "I leave the farmhouse on the eastern edge of the property, including the structure and the half-acre plot on which it stands." The room was quiet for a moment. That was it. That was the whole of it. The farmhouse, the old one, at the far edge of the land, that hadn't been properly used since before Maggie's mother died, the one with the collapsed porch railing and the windows that had been boarded up so long the boards had rotted through, the one Walter himself had called a liability more than once, had talked about demolishing, had used as a tax write-off for years because it had no functional value. That farmhouse. Maggie heard Preston exhale beside her, something between a breath and a laugh that he caught himself on just in time. Cecile studied the ceiling. Diane looked at her hands. Harmon Bell looked at Maggie over his reading glasses, with something that might have been sympathy or might have been professionalism. It was hard to tell the difference in a lawyer's face. "Do you have any questions, Margaret?" he asked. Maggie looked at the folder on his desk. She thought about every Sunday, every doctor's appointment, every phone call at midnight when Walter couldn't sleep and didn't want to be alone. She thought about the last night of his life, holding his hand in the dark. "No," she said quietly. "No questions." She stood up, shook Harmon Bell's hand, nodded to her siblings, and walked out of the office into the gray April afternoon. She made it to her car before she allowed herself to feel it, and when it hit her, it hit hard. Maggie sat in her car outside Harmon Bell's office for a long time. Long enough that the overcast sky darkened another shade and the first few drops of rain began to tap against the windshield. She didn't cry right away. The feeling was too large for tears initially. It was more like a pressure behind her ribs, a tightening that made it hard to breathe properly, hard to think in straight lines. 58 years old. She had spent 58 years being the dependable one, the quiet one, the one who showed up without being asked and left without making a fuss. She had spent the last several years of her father's life making sure he was comfortable, cared for, never alone in the hard moments. And Walter Calloway, in his final act of fatherhood, had looked at all of that and decided it was worth a crumbling farmhouse that the family used as a tax write-off. She drove home to Birchwood Lane, fed Biscuit, made herself a cup of tea she didn't drink, and sat at her kitchen table until the room went dark around her. She didn't call anyone. There was no one to call, not really. Preston would be celebrating. Diane would be carefully diplomatic in the way she always was, which somehow felt worse than honesty. Her friends in Clover Ridge were good people, but this was the kind of wound that didn't translate well into conversation. That night, Maggie made a decision. She would go see the farmhouse. She didn't know why exactly, only that she needed to look at the thing she had been given, to stand in front of it and understand what her father had thought of her in the clearest possible terms. She needed to face it rather than avoid it, because avoidance had never actually helped her with anything. She drove out to the property on a Saturday morning 3 days after the will reading. Preston had already been in touch through his lawyer to confirm boundary lines and transfer arrangements. He had not called her personally. The eastern half-acre where the farmhouse stood was now legally hers, a neat little parcel carved off from the rest of the Calloway land like a piece of gristle trimmed from a good cut of meat. The road to the farmhouse was barely a road anymore. It was more of a suggestion, 2 worn tracks through overgrown grass that led away from the main property and curved around a stand of old oak trees before arriving at a clearing where the farmhouse sat. Maggie parked and stepped out of her car into the cool morning air, and she stood there for a long moment just looking. The farmhouse was a 2-story structure built sometime in the early 1900s, back when the Calloway land had been worked more intensively and required more hands to run it. It was made of timber and stone, which meant the bones of it were probably still sound, but everything else was a disaster. The front porch had collapsed almost entirely on the left side, leaving a broken jaw of rotted wood hanging at an angle. 3 of the upper windows were either cracked through or missing completely, replaced years ago with boards that had since warped and split. Vines had claimed the entire eastern wall, threading themselves into every gap and crack with the patient determination of things that grow slowly and ruin thoroughly. The yard around it was chest-high weeds and scrub brush. An old well near the side of the house had caved in at the top. A rusted weather vane on the roof had frozen in place, pointing stubbornly northwest regardless of which way the wind actually blew. Somewhere in the eaves, birds had built nests, and their sounds were the only lively thing about the entire structure. Maggie pushed through the weeds to the front door. It was locked, but the lock was so corroded that it gave up without much of a fight when she applied pressure. The door swung inward with a sound like something exhaling after holding its breath for years. The smell was the first thing. Damp wood, dust, mildew, and underneath all of that something older and harder to name. The smell of a place that had been sealed away from living for too long. The interior was dim, the boarded windows blocking most of the light. Maggie used her phone flashlight to see clearly. The main floor was one large room with a stone fireplace dominating the far wall, a rusted kitchen range in one corner, and a wooden staircase against the left wall that led to the upper floor. The ceiling above her was stained dark with water damage in several places. The floorboards beneath her feet creaked and shifted with every step, soft in places where moisture had gotten in and done its work over years. She stood in the center of that ruin and felt the full weight of her situation settle over her like something physical. This was what 58 years of loyalty had earned her. Then something shifted inside her, not slowly but suddenly, like a rope pulled tight finally snapping clean. The sadness cracked open, and underneath it was something hotter and harder and far more useful. Anger. Clean, clarifying, righteous anger. She looked around the ruined room and said aloud to no one, to the farmhouse, to her father's memory, to Preston and Cecile and their satisfied posture in that lawyer's office, "Fine, you want to give me ruins, watch what I build." Her voice echoed off the stone fireplace and the rotted walls and came back to her sounding steadier than she felt. But she meant it, every word. Maggie did not move into the farmhouse immediately. She was practical enough to understand that the structure needed to be assessed before she could safely spend a night in it, and stubborn enough to refuse anyone's help in doing so. She spent the first week making daily trips from Birchwood Lane, arriving each morning with cleaning supplies, work gloves, and a thermos of coffee that she rationed carefully through the day. The first order of business was light. She pried the warped boards from the windows on the main floor, letting April sunlight pour into spaces it hadn't reached in years. The difference was immediate and almost startling. What had looked like pure ruin in the dimness revealed itself in daylight to be something more complicated, damaged certainly, and neglected beyond what most people would consider salvageable, but structured. The stone fireplace was intact. The timber framing, where she could see it, was solid. The farmhouse had been built by people who intended it to last, and despite everything, it had. The second order of business was the debris. Maggie filled trash bag after trash bag with the accumulated wreckage of decades of abandonment, old newspapers brittle as dead leaves, shattered crockery, the skeletal remains of furniture that had collapsed in on itself from moisture and age, animal droppings layered over everything like a second floor. She worked methodically, section by section, refusing to be overwhelmed by the scale of it, focusing only on the square foot directly in front of her. It was during the second week, while clearing the far corner of the main room near the fireplace, that Maggie noticed something about the floor. She had been pulling up a section of badly rotted boarding that had softened to the point of being genuinely dangerous underfoot. The plan was to remove the compromised sections and assess what was beneath them before deciding on repair options. She had been watching YouTube tutorials on floor restoration every evening and felt she understood the basic process well enough to at least evaluate the damage. She pried up the first rotted board with a crowbar. Then the second, the third came up in pieces, crumbling at the edges. But when she reached the fourth board, something was different. It was not rotted. In fact, it was in noticeably better condition than the surrounding boards, as if it had been treated or sealed at some point. She tapped it with the crowbar handle. The sound that came back was hollow, not the solid thud of boards over a crawl space, but the specific resonance of something enclosed directly beneath. Maggie frowned and tapped again. Hollow, unmistakably. She looked more closely at the surrounding boards. The ones framing this particular section had been cut with more precision than the rest of the floor, the joints tighter, the edges cleaner. Someone had deliberately replaced or reinforced this section at some point. Someone had wanted these boards to hold. She worked the crowbar carefully along the edge of the sealed section, applying steady pressure without forcing it. The boards were old, but they had been fixed in place with intention, and it took her a good 20 minutes of patient work before the section finally gave way and lifted clear. Beneath it was a shallow compartment, roughly 4 feet by 3 feet and about 18 inches deep, framed in stone on all 4 sides like a miniature root cellar. The stone lining had kept the moisture largely at bay. The air that rose from it was cool and dry in a way that the rest of the farmhouse was not. And inside the compartment, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth but had dried and stiffened to the texture of old leather, were 3 distinct bundles and a flat rectangular object that Maggie recognized after a moment as a wooden document box, the kind used in the 19th century to protect important papers from the elements. Her hands were shaking as she reached in and lifted the document box out first. It was heavier than she expected. The latch was a simple brass fitting that had oxidized green with age, but still functioned. She worked it open carefully. Inside, separated by thin sheets of cloth, were documents, handwritten, ink faded but legible in the afternoon light now streaming through the unboarded windows, property surveys, letters, and beneath those, something that made Maggie's breath catch entirely. A deed, old enough that the paper had gone the color of weak tea, but clear enough to read without difficulty. It described the Calloway farmhouse and the surrounding land in terms that matched the current property, but it also described something additional, something that had apparently been discovered on the land in 1887 by the original Calloway patriarch, a man named Silas Calloway, and documented with the careful precision of someone who understood he was sitting on something significant. Beneath the farmhouse, according to the deed and the accompanying geological survey, ran a natural limestone cave system, a substantial one, and within that cave system Silas Calloway had documented the existence of a freshwater underground spring of exceptional purity, along with evidence of what the surveyor described in careful Victorian language as significant mineral deposits of the type associated with commercial value. Maggie sat back on her heels on the ruined floor of the farmhouse her father had given her as an insult. She read the document again from the beginning, then a third time. Then she opened the 3 oilcloth bundles. Inside were rock samples, carefully labeled in faded ink, mineral specimens, and a small handwritten journal belonging to Silas Calloway himself, documenting his discovery of the cave system, his exploration of it over several seasons, and his belief, recorded in plain and careful language, that what lay beneath his land was worth more than anything sitting on top of it. Maggie looked up from the journal at the stone fireplace across the room, at the sunlight coming through the windows she had unboarded with her own hands, at the walls she had spent 2 weeks scrubbing clean. She thought about Preston walking out of Harmon Bell's office with 42 acres of good Tennessee farmland. She thought about Cecile's posture. She started laughing. It came up from somewhere deep and genuine and slightly bewildered, the laugh of a woman who had just understood that the joke had never been on her. Maggie drove back to Birchwood Lane that evening with the document box on the passenger seat beside her, one hand resting on it periodically as if to confirm it was still there and still real. She had wrapped it carefully in a clean towel from her supply bag, treating it with the instinctive care of someone who understood, even without fully processing everything yet, that she was handling something important. Biscuit met her at the door with the indifferent expectation of a cat who wanted his dinner and had no interest in the magnitude of anyone's afternoon. Maggie fed him, made herself a proper meal for the first time in days, and sat down at her kitchen table with the document box, a legal pad, a pen, and her laptop. She started with Silas Calloway's journal. He had been Walter's great-great-grandfather, which made him Maggie's as well, though she knew almost nothing about him beyond his name appearing occasionally in family conversation. He had settled the Calloway land in the 1870s, built the farmhouse with his own hands and those of 2 hired men, and spent the better part of a decade working the land before the discovery that consumed the final chapters of his journal. In the summer of 1887, Silas had been digging a new well on the eastern side of the property, the half-acre that was now Maggie's, when his equipment broke through into what he described as a hollow beneath the earth that rang like a bell when the tool struck it. Curious and methodical in equal measure, Silas had spent the following weeks carefully excavating an access point and descending into what revealed itself to be a limestone cave system of considerable size. His descriptions were precise and evocative at the same time. Vast chambers, calcite formations, an underground stream of cold, clear water running through the deepest section, and along the walls of that stream, mineral deposits that caught his lantern light and glittered in ways that made him stop and collect samples before he fully understood what he was looking at. He had sent those samples to a geological surveyor in Nashville. The surveyor's report was included in the oilcloth bundles, a formal document in faded but readable ink that identified the mineral deposits as including significant concentrations of calcite, aragonite, and what the surveyor described with careful professional restraint as formations consistent with commercially valuable mineral extraction. Additionally, the report noted that the underground spring showed characteristics of exceptional water purity and consistent mineral content, making it potentially suitable for medicinal or commercial use. Silas had intended to develop the discovery. The journal made that clear. He had corresponded with investors, drawn up rough plans, spoken to engineers, but the journal ended abruptly in 1889, and the property records Maggie had found indicated that Silas had died unexpectedly that same year, leaving the land to a son who had apparently never been told about what lay beneath it, or if he had been told, had not believed it enough to pursue it. And so the secret had passed out of living memory, buried beneath a farmhouse floor that successive generations of Calloways had either ignored or forgotten, until now. Maggie spent 3 nights reading everything twice, taking careful notes and beginning to research what any of it meant in the present day. She was not a geologist or a historian or a businesswoman. She was a 58-year-old office administrator with a vegetable garden and a tabby cat. But she had spent 22 years organizing complex information for the County Agricultural Extension Office, and she knew how to research, how to find the right people, and how to ask the right questions. What she learned in those first nights of research was both thrilling and sobering. Limestone cave systems on private land were not uncommon in Tennessee, which sat atop one of the most significant karst landscapes in the eastern United States. But documented cave systems of substantial size, with historical records, underground water sources, and associated mineral deposits, were considerably rarer and considerably more valuable. Cave systems on private land could be developed for tourism, for scientific research partnerships, for educational programs. The underground spring alone, if water testing confirmed its historical characterization, could support applications ranging from bottled water operations to therapeutic wellness facilities. The mineral deposits required professional geological assessment before anyone could speak to their current commercial value. But the historical surveyor's report was a legitimate starting point. The obstacles were significant. Maggie had no capital to speak of. Her savings were modest. The alimony from her county job pension was years away. Any serious development of what lay beneath the farmhouse would require professional geological surveys, environmental assessments, legal work around mineral rights, and eventually significant investment. It was not something she could do alone or quickly or cheaply, but there were avenues she hadn't considered initially. Tennessee had historical preservation programs. The State Geological Survey Office partnered with private landowners in certain circumstances. Universities with geology and archaeology departments sometimes sought access to significant cave systems for research, and that access could translate into resources and attention that opened other doors. She needed expert eyes on what she had found. She needed someone who could tell her whether Silas Calloway's discovery was as significant as his 19th-century surveyor had believed, or whether time and geological change had altered what was down there in ways that made the old documents more history than opportunity. The nearest town with a hardware store and a reliable internet connection beyond Clover Ridge's limited offerings was Harlow, 40 minutes east on the county road. Maggie had driven through it a handful of times, but never had reason to stop. On a Thursday morning, she drove out there with a specific purpose. She needed supplies for the farmhouse, but she also needed to ask around about who in the region might know anything about cave systems and geological surveys. It was in Harlow's feed and hardware store that she met Hector. Hector Oviedo was in his early 60s, a compact and deliberate man who had run the store for 20 years and seemed to know everyone in a 3-county radius. He had grown up in East Tennessee and had the particular local knowledge of a man who had spent his whole life paying attention to the land around him. When Maggie somewhat hesitantly described what she had found beneath the farmhouse floor, Hector set down the inventory clipboard he was holding and looked at her with an expression of focused interest that she hadn't expected. "You said limestone formation, underground spring?" he asked. "That's what the old survey says. I haven't been down there myself yet." Hector nodded slowly. "There's a professor at the University of Tennessee Extension Program, Geology Department. Name is Dr. Carol Sims. She's been documenting cave systems in this region for about 15 years. If what you've got is real, she'll want to know about it, and she'll tell you straight what you have." Maggie wrote the name down on her notepad. It was the first door. She pushed it open. Dr. Carol Sims arrived at the farmhouse on a Tuesday morning in late May, 6 weeks after Maggie had first contacted her through the University of Tennessee Extension Program. She came with 2 graduate students, a professional-grade lighting system, rappelling equipment, and the measured enthusiasm of a scientist who had learned over 15 years not to get ahead of the evidence. She was a small woman in her mid-50s with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of practical efficiency that Maggie recognized and immediately respected. She shook Maggie's hand at the edge of the property, looked at the farmhouse with a professional eye, and asked to see the documents before she looked at anything else. Maggie spread them on the makeshift table she had set up in the main room, a sheet of plywood across 2 sawhorses, her current workspace for everything related to the farmhouse restoration. Dr. Sims studied the geological survey, the deed, and Silas Calloway's journal with the focused attention of someone reading a language they knew well. Her graduate student stood quietly behind her. After 20 minutes, Dr. Sims looked up. "Where's the access point?" Maggie showed her the compartment beneath the floor. Dr. Sims knelt beside it and shone her flashlight downward, then turned to her students and said something technical that Maggie didn't fully follow but that produced visible interest in both of them. "We'll need to excavate this properly before anyone goes down," Dr. Sims said. "But the formation characteristics visible from here are consistent with what your surveyor described. The limestone composition of this region absolutely supports what these documents claim." She paused. "This could be significant, Miss Calloway. I don't want to promise you anything before we assess it properly, but I want to be honest. I've been looking for documented cave systems in this county for 3 years. If this is what it appears to be, this is a serious find." The excavation of the access point took 3 days. Dr. Sims and her team worked carefully and methodically, documenting everything. On the 4th day, Dr. Sims descended into the cave system for the first time. Maggie stood at the edge of the opening and waited with a patience that cost her considerably. When Dr. Sims came back up an hour later, her expression was composed, but her eyes were bright in a way that told Maggie everything before a word was spoken. "It's intact," Dr. Sims said. "The main chamber is approximately 60 feet below the surface. The formations are extraordinary. Stalactites, stalagmites, flowstone. The underground stream is active and clear, and the mineral deposits your great-great-grandfather documented are present and substantial." She paused. "Miss Calloway, this cave system is one of the most significant undocumented limestone formations I have encountered in 15 years of fieldwork in this state." Maggie sat down on the edge of the old porch because her legs made the decision before she did. What followed over the next several months moved faster than Maggie had imagined possible once the right doors were opened. Dr. Sims submitted a formal geological assessment to the university, which generated immediate academic interest. The Tennessee Historical Commission was contacted regarding the property's historical significance, given both the documented 19th century discovery and the original farmhouse structure itself. Applications were submitted for historical designation and for a state geological research partnership that would bring university resources to the site in exchange for documented access. In August, 4 months after Maggie had first pried up those rotted floorboards, the Tennessee Historical Commission formally designated the Calloway farmhouse and cave system as a site of significant historical and geological interest. The designation came with preservation funding, not a vast amount, but enough to begin proper structural restoration of the farmhouse and to develop a safe and regulated access point to the cave system below. Through all of it, Maggie kept working. She had not stopped the physical restoration of the farmhouse for a single day throughout the investigation and research process. She had learned to replace damaged timber framing from YouTube tutorials she watched every evening. She had learned basic masonry to address the crumbling sections of the stone fireplace surround. She had rebuilt the front porch herself over the course of 3 weekends, working from early morning until the light failed, measuring twice and cutting once with the careful precision of someone who could not afford to waste materials. Her hands changed, her body changed. The soft, desk job physicality of 22 years of office work gave way to something harder and more capable. She lost weight she hadn't been trying to lose. She slept deeply every night in a way she hadn't in years. There was a satisfaction in physical work that she had never known before, a directness to it that her old life had entirely lacked. You did the work. You saw the result. There was no ambiguity. By September, the farmhouse was unrecognizable from the structure she had first stood in front of on that cool April morning. The porch was solid and straight. The windows were repaired and gleaming. The interior walls had been cleaned, treated, and refinished. The floors, the ones she hadn't removed, had been sanded and sealed. The stone fireplace had been professionally cleaned and made functional again. It was beautiful, not in spite of its age but because of it. The farmhouse looked like what it was, a structure built to last by people who cared about permanence, restored by a woman who understood that some things were worth saving. In October, a regional heritage publication ran a feature on the Calloway farmhouse and cave system. The article told Maggie's story with an honesty she hadn't expected. The will reading, the overlooked daughter, The crumbling farmhouse, the discovery beneath the floor. It included photographs of the restored building and of Maggie herself, standing on the porch she had rebuilt with her own hands. Maggie barely recognized the woman in those photographs. She was tanned and lean, her dark hair, which she had stopped having highlighted, streaked through with gray that she had decided she had earned. She was wearing work clothes and boots, standing straight, looking directly into the camera with an expression that she could only describe when she saw it as settled. Not happy exactly, not yet, but settled. Sure of herself in a way that the woman who had sat in Harmon Bell's office 8 months ago had not been. She looked like someone who had built something with her own hands, because she had. The article in the Heritage publication came out on a Friday. By the following Monday, Maggie had received 43 emails from strangers, 2 interview requests from local newspapers, and 1 phone call from Preston. She let Preston's call go to voicemail. She listened to it once, standing in the farmhouse kitchen she had restored, looking out through the clean window at the oak trees turning gold at the edges in the October light. Preston's voice was measured and careful in the way it always was when he wanted something. He said he had read the article. He said he was proud of what she had accomplished. He said he thought they should talk, that there were some family matters worth discussing, that he hoped they could find a time that worked for both of them. Maggie deleted the voicemail and went back to work. He called again on Wednesday. Then Diane called on Thursday, her tone warmer than Preston's but carrying the same careful undercurrent of purpose. Maggie answered Diane's call because she had always found it harder to avoid her sister than her brother, and because she was curious to hear how Diane would frame it. "I've been thinking about you so much," Diane said. "Raymond and I both read the article. Maggie, what you've done out there is just remarkable, truly. We're so proud." "Thank you, Diane." A pause. "I was also thinking, and I hope this doesn't come across the wrong way, that Daddy would have wanted the family to be involved in something like this, something on Calloway land, something connected to the family history." There it was. "The farmhouse is on my land," Maggie said. "The half-acre Daddy left me." Of course. I just mean Preston and I have been talking, and we feel like maybe the will didn't fully account for something like this. That nobody could have known what was there, and family should support family, shouldn't they? If there's a way for all of us to be part of what you're building—" "Diane," Maggie said quietly. "Stop." Diane stopped. "I sat in Harmon Bell's office and I watched Preston walk away with 42 acres and the family business and most of Daddy's savings. I watched you receive the lake house and Mama's jewelry and the antique furniture. I received a farmhouse that nobody had stepped inside in over a decade. Nobody suggested then that the will hadn't fully accounted for things. Nobody raised concerns about fairness when the distribution favored the two of you. I'm not finished." Maggie's voice was steady. She surprised herself with how steady it was. "I came to this farmhouse alone. I cleaned it alone. I restored it alone. I found what was beneath that floor alone. I contacted Dr. Sims. I worked with the Historical Commission. I rebuilt that porch board by board with my own hands while the two of you were living your lives. Everything this property is becoming is the result of my work and my determination. Not the family name, not shared history. Mine." Silence on the line. "I understand that you feel the discovery changes things," Maggie continued, "but the discovery only happened because I was here. And I was here because you and Preston were perfectly comfortable accepting what Daddy left you without a single question. So no, Diane, there is no piece of this for you or for Preston. The farmhouse is mine. What's beneath it is mine. What I build here is mine." Diane's voice when it came back was smaller. "Maggie, I know we haven't always. I don't want an apology right now. I want you to hear what I've said." Another silence. Then, "I hear you." They said goodbye and hung up. 2 days later, Preston appeared in person. He drove up the restored gravel path Maggie had laid herself and parked in front of the farmhouse on a Saturday morning while Maggie was outside with Hector, who had become a genuine friend over the months and who was helping her assess the fencing around the property boundary. Preston got out of his car and stood looking at the farmhouse with an expression that Maggie could read clearly even from a distance. Shock. Genuine, unguarded shock at what the place had become. He was wearing a jacket rather than a suit, which she supposed was his version of dressing down for a difficult conversation. He looked older than she remembered from the will reading, tired in a way that expensive clothes couldn't entirely disguise. Hector glanced at Maggie. She gave him a small nod that said she was fine, and he stepped back, busying himself with the fence line at a respectful distance. Preston walked toward her. They stood 8 feet apart on the property that had been given to her as an insult and which she had turned into something neither of them had imagined possible. "It's incredible," Preston said, looking at the farmhouse. "What you've done here, I mean that sincerely." "I know you do," Maggie said. "And I know that's not why you came." He had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I've spoken to my own lawyer about the mineral rights, about whether the cave system, given that it likely extends beneath the broader property boundary." "Preston." Her voice was calm and clear. "I've already spoken to my lawyer about exactly that. The cave system access point and the documented discovery originate entirely within my half-acre. The mineral rights associated with the documented historical claim are attached to this parcel. My lawyer has reviewed everything thoroughly." She paused. "You have no claim here, legally or otherwise." Preston's jaw tightened. For a moment he looked like he might argue further. Then something went out of him, some last remaining posture of entitlement, and he just looked like a tired man standing in front of his younger sister on a cool October morning. "I should have called you," he said finally, "after the will reading. I should have called and I didn't." "No, you didn't. I told myself it wasn't my decision, that it was Dad's choice and I had to respect it." "You respected it very comfortably, Preston." He nodded slowly. "There was nothing to argue with in that. I'm sorry, Maggie. I think I've known for a while that what happened wasn't right, that you deserved better, from Dad and from me." Maggie looked at her brother for a long moment, at the face she had known her entire life, at the man who had accepted 42 acres and a family business without a second thought while she drove away from a lawyer's office with a deed to a ruin. "I appreciate you saying that," she said. "I mean that, but an apology doesn't open a door here that's already closed. What I've built is mine. I need you to understand that and accept it." Preston looked at the farmhouse one more time, at the porch she had rebuilt, at the windows that caught the morning light, at the woman standing in front of him who was no longer the quiet one, no longer the background of the family portrait. "I understand," he said quietly. He shook her hand. He got in his car. He drove away down the gravel path she had laid herself. Maggie watched him go. Then she turned back to Hector, who handed her a fence post without a word, and the kind of uncomplicated solidarity that she had come to value more than she could easily express. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and picked up her end of the post. "Let's finish the fence." The Calloway farmhouse and cave system opened to the public for the first time on a Saturday morning in April, exactly 1 year after Maggie had first pushed open that rotted front door and stood alone in the ruin her father had left her. It was not a grand opening in any commercial sense. There were no banners or caterers or formal speeches. There was coffee and homemade biscuits on the restored front porch, a small crowd of perhaps 60 people, local community members, Dr. Sims and her research team, representatives from the Tennessee Historical Commission, a few journalists, and a larger number of women who had read the Heritage article and driven from across the county simply to see it with their own eyes. Maggie stood on the porch she had built and looked out at all of them and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not relief, though that was part of it. Not pride, though that was there too. What she felt, most accurately, was whole. Like a version of herself she hadn't known was missing, had walked back through the door and settled in properly. The cave system tours were conducted in small groups of 6, led by one of Dr. Sims's graduate students who had accepted a part-time position with the operation through the university partnership. The tours descended via a properly engineered access staircase that had been built over the original excavation point, lit with carefully positioned lighting that preserved the atmosphere of the space while making it safely navigable. The underground stream ran clear and cold through the deepest chamber, and the mineral formations on the walls caught the light in ways that made every tour group go quiet for a moment when they first saw them. The water from the underground spring had been independently tested and confirmed as exceptionally pure, with a mineral content that multiple wellness consultants had described as commercially significant. Maggie was in early-stage discussions with a small artisan water company about a partnership arrangement that would allow limited and sustainable extraction under strict environmental guidelines. It was one of several revenue streams she was developing carefully, unwilling to rush anything that might compromise the integrity of what she had found. The farmhouse itself operated as a historical site and event space, available for small gatherings, educational programs, and private tours. It was already booked through the following spring on weekends. The historical designation had brought a level of attention that Maggie had not anticipated and was still learning to manage. She had hired 2 people from Clover Ridge, a young woman named Bet who handled bookings and correspondence, and an older man named Gil who managed the grounds and had proven to have a gift for explaining geological formations to visitors of all ages in ways that made them feel genuinely connected to the history beneath their feet. They were good people, and Maggie was proud of the small livelihood she was creating for them alongside her own. Her blog, which she had begun quietly and almost accidentally during the winter months, had grown into something she hadn't expected. She had called it What's Beneath, a title that worked on several levels simultaneously and that readers seemed to respond to. She wrote honestly about the process of rebuilding the farmhouse and developing the cave system, but she also wrote about what the experience had taught her about herself, about being overlooked, about the particular kind of invisibility that comes to women of a certain age in a certain kind of family, about the strange liberation of being given the thing nobody else wanted and discovering it was the thing that changed everything. The response had been larger than anything she had anticipated. Women wrote to her from across the country, women who had been passed over in family estates, women who had been dismissed by siblings and spouses and employers and entire systems that had decided their value was negligible, women who were 60 and 70 and even 80 years old, who wanted someone to tell them that it was not too late, that the dismissal was not the final word, that what other people called their ending was not actually their ending at all. Maggie answered as many of those messages as she could. She read every one. She understood them in a way that she could not have understood them a year ago, because a year ago she had been sitting in her car outside a lawyer's office, feeling the full crushing weight of being found insufficient by the people who were supposed to know her best. She thought about that woman sometimes, the one who had driven out to the farmhouse on that cold April morning expecting to find confirmation of her own worthlessness, and had found instead the greatest opportunity of her life sealed beneath a rotted floor. She thought about Walter, about the complicated grief of loving a parent who never quite saw you clearly. She had made a kind of peace with it, not a clean peace, not the kind that erased the hurt entirely, but the kind that was honest about both the love and the wound, and decided to hold them together without letting either one cancel the other out. Walter had not known what was beneath that floor. She genuinely believed that. He had not given her the farmhouse as a hidden gift. He had given it to her because it was the thing he valued least. But in doing so, he had accidentally handed her the only thing she had ever truly needed, a space that was entirely her own, where everything she built would be built by her hands and her choices, and her refusal to accept that being overlooked meant being without worth. She had needed to be given the ruin in order to discover what she was capable of building. On the evening of the opening, after the last visitors had gone and Bet and Gil had headed home and the farmhouse was quiet again, Maggie sat on her porch with a glass of sweet tea and watched the sun go down behind the Tennessee hills. The light came in long and golden across the property, catching the oak trees and the restored timber of the farmhouse walls and the new fencing along the boundary line, and everything it touched looked like it had always been exactly as it was. Hector stopped by on his way home from the hardware store, the way he had taken to doing on significant days. He sat in the other porch chair without being invited, which was exactly right, and they sat in comfortable silence for a while watching the light change. "Good day," he said eventually. "Very good day," Maggie agreed. They sat a while longer. "You know what I keep thinking about," Maggie said. "What's that?" "That if any of it had gone differently, if Daddy had seen me clearly, if Preston hadn't walked away with everything, if they'd given me literally anything else, I wouldn't be here. I'd be somewhere comfortable and quiet and slowly disappearing. This place, this exact place, is what I needed, and I only got it because nobody thought it was worth giving me anything better." Hector considered that. "Funny how that works." "Isn't it?" Maggie said. The last light faded over the hills and the first stars appeared above the farmhouse, above the land, above everything sealed beneath it that was slowly, carefully, on her own terms, being brought into the light. Maggie raised her glass of sweet tea to the evening sky, to Silas Calloway who had found something magnificent and hidden it carefully for a future he couldn't see, to Walter who had given her the ruin without knowing it was a gift, to Preston and Diane who had taken everything they wanted and left her the one thing that turned out to matter, and to herself, to the woman who had showed up alone with work gloves and a thermos of coffee and refused to let what other people thought of her become what she thought of herself. To every woman reading this or hearing this who has been passed over, looked through, handed the thing nobody else wanted. This is for you, the farmhouse nobody fought for, the opportunity disguised as a consolation prize, the chapter that looked like an ending and turned out to be the only beginning that ever really counted. You are not what you were given, you are what you build from it. It is not too late. It was never too late. Beneath the floor of whatever ruin you've been handed, something is waiting. Go find it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.